So last Saturday we had tens of thousands of people marching right through the centre of London for what they called the United Kingdom rally. You know, these guys, they carried the Union Jacks, they carried the wooden crosses, they chanted. Their little flares were right beside the statue of Winston Churchill. You know, from that space in Parliament Square, the man that was leading the whole thing, Tommy Robinson, he stood before that crowd and he said plainly and explicitly that it was time for many Muslims to leave the country. He said, and I'm quoting him exactly, I would stop Islam. You know, he called it a battle for Britain, the beginning of a cultural revolution. Let's talk about this cultural revolution. You know, 4,000 police officers deployed, 9 arrests for hate crimes, 6 officers subjected to hate crime offences during the event itself. You know, there was even a woman in the crowd who was filmed carrying 3 knives, saying out loud that she hated black people. There were crowds that were recorded chanting about sinking boats, about taking life jackets of human beings in the channel. And they were asking, why didn't we just kill them right there on the beach? Flyers handed out calling for a future for white people. And you know, Tommy Robinson and all of those speakers on stage, the ones that were driving the anger, the ones orchestrating this whole madness, they weren't amongst those that were arrested. So I want to talk about what was really on show, really on display that day. You know, and I don't just mean the march. You know, I mean something bigger than Tommy Robinson. Because what I watched last weekend, it wasn't some fringe event. No. It wasn't a temporary madness. It wasn't even a deviation from British values. It was a complete expression of them. And, you know, I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, okay? Because I know how it lands. You know, and I know the immediate instinct is to push back, you know, to get offensive, to get defensive, to say, no, this isn't us. That's just a radical element. So let me earn it. You know, let me actually dissect this whole thing. Because I think if you follow this argument through to the end, whether you agree with me or not, you know, you will at least not be able to say that you didn't know. Alright? So there is a myth at the very center of modern Western civilization. You know, it's probably the most successful myth ever constructed. You know, it's been told so many times, so consistently, for so long, that it's become the background noise of how most people understand reality. And the myth, it says this. It says that the West, and Britain specifically, you know, developed over centuries into a unique set of universal values. We're talking democracy, the rule of law, individual rights, tolerance, freedom. You know, and they view it as the absolute peak of human achievement. And that the role of the West in the wider world has been broadly to bring these values to places that don't have them. You know, the empire wasn't perfect. There were things that were done that shouldn't have been done. But on balance, you know, the project was a civilizing one. On balance, the world is better for it. On balance, Britain should be proud. Now, before we look at the actual history, I want to say something about the psychology behind that myth. You know, because it explains a lot about what you saw from Tommy Robinson on Saturday. And it explains why these conversations get so incredibly vicious. What looks like a superiority complex is actually not that. You know, or actually, even that term there, it needs to be interrogated a little bit. You know, superiority complex. Because in fact, what we're talking about most of the time is not a sense of actually being superior. It's a pathology. It's an internal sickness. It's a condition which compels them to always want, to always need, to invalidate and delegitimize and subordinate others. They're not sitting comfortably in a state of assured certainty, about their superiority. No, they need to be assured that others will counter them. And that's the basis for proving their superiority to themselves. Do you understand? Because if you're superior, if you genuinely believe that you are superior, intellectually, culturally, morally, racially, then I don't think that you feel threatened or intimidated by others. You wouldn't be agitated or angry when someone failed to defer to you. But that's not what I see. That's not what you see. What you see is a civilization where being treated as a superior by the rest of us is the only way it can really feel like it's on top. That's the only way. Your superiority relies entirely on enforcing the inferiority of others and then having them comply with that whole arrangement. Which means that the moment someone refuses that compliance, the moment someone looks at it and says, actually, let me show you what the record looks like, it agitates something very deep under the skin. And it's not because the argument is wrong. It's because the argument threatens the only mechanism through which that superiority was ever real in the first place. So this conversation isn't really about history. It's about whether you are willing to have the validation you've always been given taken away from you. Some people are, most people aren't. But the argument still needs to be made. Right? That myth is the absolute foundation of everything that you saw on that march last Saturday. And we're not talking just the extreme end, the respectable end as well. The part that says we're just trying to protect our culture. The part that says we've built something worth protecting. The part that says our values are under threat. Think about it. You cannot sincerely believe your values need defending unless you first believe that those values were genuinely good. And the march was full of people who genuinely believed that. And that isn't a statement about their intelligence. It's a statement about what they've been taught, what they've never been shown. So I want to show it. I want to show what real British values look like when you take them out of the myth and then you put them into the historical record. And before we go any further, I'm not saying this to make anyone feel guilty. I don't think individuals today are responsible for what their ancestors did. But you simply cannot understand what is happening in this country right now without understanding what this country has actually been. So let's start with India. In the 1750s, the Indian subcontinent accounted for approximately 25% of global industrial output. It was the most productive, wealthy economies on earth. And then by the 1900s, after roughly 150 years of British rule, that figure, it collapsed to just 2%. That's not a natural consequence of modernization. It's not even a global competition. That is the documented result of deliberate British policy. And there's an extraordinary piece of research published by Columbian University by the economist Utsa. It calculated that Britain extracted between 45 and $64 trillion worth of wealth from India between 1765 and 1938. And you know that the mechanism was so precise. It's actually ingenious. You know, the East India Company, it collected taxes from the Indian population and then used a portion of those very taxes to buy Indian goods for British use. Think about that. British traders were acquiring Indian products for free, you know, using money that they had just taken from the people making those products. You know, this is not a grey area. This is straight up plunder. It is colonial theft operating in plain sight. You know, it's dressed up in a language of commerce so that the people doing it, they can find a way to look at themselves in the mirror. Not trade, plunder, dressed as trade. You know, while these extractions were running, famines were sweeping the subcontinent with a regularity that had absolutely no precedent in the centuries before British rule. Over 30 million Indians died in famines under the British Empire. In 1943, there was the Bengal famine. It's probably the most heavily documented. A 2019 study published in Geophysical Research Letters, it analyzed soil moisture data going back to 1870, and they found that the 1943 famine was the only major Indian famine in the entire period that was not linked to drought or crop failure. Why? Because it was caused by policy. You know, Winston Churchill's war cabinet was warned repeatedly by the Viceroy, by the Secretary of State for India, by senior military commanders, that people were dying in millions in Bengal. The requests for food imports were denied. And then grain continued to be exported out of India while people starved. Australia offered food shipments, declined. Other nations offered food shipments, declined. You know, when the news reached Churchill's desk, his documented response was to ask why Gandhi hadn't died yet. You know, when he was told about the death toll, he blamed the Indians for breeding like rabbits. You know, this is not wartime pressure. This is the dehumanization of an entire people. You know, 3 million people died in Bengal in 1943. And it wasn't because of nature. It was because a government 5,000 miles away looked at millions of human beings starving, and it decided that their lives were worth less than the logistics of an empire. And this is the man whose statue stands in Parliament Square. You know, the very square where Tommy Robinson addressed his crowd. You know, it's very fitting. Let's move on to Africa. You know, Kenya in the 1950s. The Kikuyu people, they launched what became known as the Mau Mau Uprising. And the cause was straightforward. British settlers had seized over 60,000 acres of Kikuyu land. Families who had farmed that land for generations were dispossessed, you know, pushed into crowded reserves or forced into servitude on land that used to be theirs. But the whole uprising was a response to that. So what was the British government's response? They declared a state of emergency and they built what they called detention camps. In fact, they were just torture facilities. You know, we're talking about tens of thousands of Kenyans who were detained without trial, castration, electric shock, systematic beatings, rape. You know, these aren't allegations. These are documented testimonies that were given by survivors to British courts. You know, this was the British state operating in the name of British values. It was running a systematic program of torture against civilians whose only crime was wanting their land back. You know, estimates of the death toll range from 11,000 to 50,000. And the higher figure, calculated by John Blacker, It found that roughly half of those deaths were children under 10 years old. Children under 10. When lawyers began investigating this in the 2000s, they discovered that the colonial office and the foreign office hadn't kept the documentation. They systematically destroyed it. They burnt the files because they knew exactly what had been done. And, they needed to make sure that it could never be proven. It wasn't until 2013 that the British government finally paid reparations to 5,000 surviving victims. This was the first time Britain had ever paid reparations for colonial crimes. 5,000 people. After tens of thousands of deaths, after the evidence had been incinerated, after decades of survivors being ignored and told to move on. And then we look at the slavery. Britain transported approximately 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. And that's according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. That's more than any other European nation in the 18th century. The wealth from that trade built some of the oldest financial institutions in the City of London. We're talking about the most celebrated country houses, the universities that educate the men who wrote the laws of the empire. When slavery was abolished in 1833, the British government, it paid £20 million in compensation. That was approximately 40% of the Treasury's entire annual expenditure back then. In today's money, that's about £17 billion. But let's look at who it went to. Of course, it was paid to the slave owners. Why? For the loss of their property. The slave people, they received nothing. Not a penny, not even an acknowledgement. And this debt, the absolute obscenity of government deciding that the feelings of people who owned human beings matter more than the human beings that they that were owned. It was only fully paid off by British taxpayers in 2015. People alive right now were still paying off the compensation to slave owners. Think about that. That's not ancient history. We're talking about 2015. This is the civilization whose values are being defended. There's also a number that almost never gets mentioned in these conversations, but it should always be front and center. From the beginning of Christianity until what the West calls the Enlightenment, across roughly 15,000 years of what people dismiss as the religious Dark Ages. Historians estimate somewhere between 10 and 25 million people died in conflicts that were broadly religious. That works out to around 6,000 to 15,000 deaths a year. But then the Enlightenment arrived. Reason replaced religion. Science replaced superstition. Western civilization finally grew up. Or so the story goes. And in the roughly 350 years since then, the secular, rational, enlightened West has killed somewhere between 250 and 500 million people. That's 20 times the death toll in a quarter of the time. That's not in the name of God. It's in the name of empire, of progress, civilization, racial size, economic expansion, national interest. So when someone tells you that Western secular values represent the absolute highest achievement of human organization, you are fully entitled to ask, by what measure exactly? Because if we're measuring human bodies, boy, that track record is absolutely remarkable. It's just not in the way, not in the direction that the myth suggests. And I want to be careful here, because the standard response to this is always, it always misses the actual point. The liberal response to events like last Saturday is to say that those marches do not represent real British values. That they say that true Britain is tolerant and open and decent. That this march was a betrayal of what the country stands for. And look, there is truth to that. Britain did abolish slavery. Britain did eventually grant independence. Britain did build a welfare system, a welfare state, and a national health service that have done remarkable things for ordinary people. None of that is being erased. But here's the thing. The same country that abolished slavery paid the slave owners. The same country that granted independence had already burnt the records of what it had done over there. The same country that built the NHS was running detention camps in Kenya at the exact same time. These things aren't contradictions. They're the full picture. The myth says, look at the good that we did. The historical record says, look at who paid the price for it and whether they even had a say in the matter. There's a pattern in that record that is worth naming. Throughout British history, whenever the pressure built internally, whenever ordinary people here were struggling and angry and looking for answers, the answers provided by those with actual power has always been to point somewhere else. There was a academic research from Cambridge. Is completely unambiguous about this. The research was about the concept of working class whiteness as a distinct political identity in Britain. And in the large part, it was constructed in the early 19th century precisely to separate poor white British workers this movement. It was designed to give them an identity that felt above enslaved people, even when their material conditions weren't far removed. Think about it. The working class person in Lancashire in 1820 had almost nothing, but they had this. They were told they were not a slave. And that distinction was cultivated deliberately by the exact same ruling class that was profiting from both the mill worker and the slave. Keep them apart. Keep them pointing at each other. It's a very old trick. It seems to work every single time. What happened last Saturday is not just it's just that exact same trick running again. The people on that march are not in Maine the people with power in this country. Look at a man leading them, naming himself as the vanguard of cultural revolution, when the reality of his records show convictions for assault, mortgage fraud, fake passports, contempt of court. We're talking about a man who was jailed for spreading documented libels against a 15-year-old Syrian refugee kid. This is the man who looks at a crowd of tens of thousands of people and says, I would stop Islam. Think about the absolute insanity of that statement. Think about what it actually means. When Tommy Robinson says he wants to stop Islam, when he says it's time for Muslims to leave, he's invoking one of the most oldest, most foundational logic of the British Empire. Because the empire was never built on tolerance. It was built on the absolute right of the British state to decide which populations were permitted to exist and which cultures were allowed to breed, and then who must be subordinated for that project to survive. So when he stands in Parliament Square making those threats, he's not inventing a new ideology. He's channeling the exact same civilizational arrogance that allowed a war cabinet 5,000 miles away to let millions of people starve in Bengal. He's channeling the exact same worldview that allowed colonial administrators to look at Kenyan children under 10 and decide that their lives were entirely disposable. He thinks he's a rebel. He thinks he's anti-establishment. But the reality is that Tommy Robinson is the ultimate puppet of the historical British state. He is executing their script to perfection. He's standing at the bottom of the ladder, screaming at the religious minority, so that nobody looks up at the people holding the ladder. Do you understand? Because those people marching have real grievances. The communities that turned out last Saturday have watched their towns hollow out. They've watched their industries disappear. They've watched housing become unaffordable. They've watched they've seen services get cut, and the promise that hard work leads to security quietly expire. These are real things. The anger is real. The sense of loss is real. But what is not real is the explanation that they've been handed. The explanation that the source of their loss is immigration. That the threat to their way of life is a religious minority. That explanation is a blatant lie, and it is deliberate. It's manufactured. A historically consistent lie that has been told to working class British people for 200 years by the exact same class of people who were extracting from them at the same time they were extracting from the rest of the world. Point them at the person at the bottom. Make sure they never look at the person at the top. And it keeps working because the anger it feeds on is genuine, even when the target it provides is completely wrong. So let's dissect the absolute violence of this arrangement. Consider what it means to look at a working class community that has been systematically asset stripped by its own political class. Instead of giving them schools or hospitals or industries, you hand them a scapegoat. You train them like animals to point their rage downward. You teach them that their poverty is not the result of corporate greed or political plunder, but the fault of a mother wearing a burqa or a hijab, or a family fleeing a conflict zone in a rubber dinghy. And what happens when this lie is challenged? What happens when you bring the actual historical ledger into the light? The entire system collapses into absolute panic, because the survival of the dominant paradigm depends completely on the ignorance of the people inside it. If the working class people marching for Tommy Robinson ever discovered that the wealth of that this nation was built on was because of systematic slaughter and looting of the global south, and that they themselves are now being extracted from by the exact same financial structures, they wouldn't be marching against Islam. They will be marching against the City of London. They will be turning their anger against the very institutions that profit from their division. That's exactly why Tommy Robinson is allowed to stand in Parliament Square and threaten a religious minority while the state watches. He's performing a vital utility for the ruling class. He's a buffer. He's a noise machine. He's a noise machine that prevents the working class from ever asking who actually owns the land, who owns the wealth, and who's pocketing the dividends of their misery. So let's look at the double standards from last Saturday. Let's look at it because it makes the entire hierarchy nakedly visible. And that march, a man stood on stage and openly threatened the presence of an entire religious minority. On the exact same day, at a separate demonstration nearby, a person was arrested for holding a sign expressing solidarity with Palestine. Another person was arrested for holding a sign supporting a group that the government had banned. The far-right speakers inciting hatred were left completely untouched. It was the people with signs that were locked in cells. This isn't it's not a coincidence. This is a policy statement. It's the same statement this country has been making for centuries. It's just got an updated language. Some people's presence is treated as default. Some people's presence requires justification. Some people's speech is called free speech. Some people's speech is called extremism. The ordinary working class people who came from all over the country last Saturday, they came because they genuinely believe that they are defending something. They are not the beneficiaries of the hierarchy. They are just useful to it. The hierarchy needs them angry, and needs them pointed in the wrong direction. It needs them marching through London carrying flags instead of asking who owns the land those flags are flying over. We've got a lot of people saying that the mosque slipped on Saturday, but the mosque did not slip. That's what I want most of you to leave with, because saying that the mosque slipped means that the true face of Britain was accidentally revealed. But the historical records show that there was never a mosque. What was on display on the streets of London last Saturday, the dehumanization, the scapegoating, the readiness to direct legitimate anger at the wrong target. Those were not departures from British history. They are a recurring feature of it. What the Bengal famine was, what the Mau camps were, what the slave compensation was. The specific targets change, but the structure does not. The question is not whether this country has good values. Most people in most countries have good values. Most people want to live decent lives and treat others fairly. The question is, who gets to define what the values are, and who gets protected by them? And who has historically paid the price every time this country needed someone to point out? Look, I know these aren't comfortable questions, but they are the only ones that lead anywhere useful. Because if you understand what has actually been happening, you stop blaming the wrong people. You stop carrying a flag for a project that was never yours. And you start asking the only question that actually matters. And that's who benefits from the way things are. And once you know the answer to that, you can start deciding yourself whether you want to keep helping them or not.